Well, good afternoon. I'd like to sincerely thank James and all the folks at Heartland for putting on this conference. I know you guys do a lot of hard work to get here, so thank you for doing this. And thank you for everyone for attending today. As James mentioned earlier, my name is Tiffany Roberts, and I'm affiliated with an organization called the California Aspire Project. And we work with local communities to help spread the word about California's climate policies and what they mean to low-income families and working-class families. I'm an economist by training, and I've served as an energy and climate policy advisor in California for almost 10 years now. I actually started out my career right around the time that California passed the landmark legislation known as the Global Warming Solutions Act. And at that time, I was working for a local government in the Bay Area. I was doing cost-benefit analysis on their climate action plan. And then I moved to Sacramento, where I started to work for the state's nonpartisan legislative analyst office. I served as their senior energy and climate policy analyst for the California legislature for about 5 years. And for those of you who are not familiar with the legislative analyst office, it's essentially like like California's version of the Congressional Budget Office. But the distinction between the two offices is that the CBO does analysis, and then they let the analysis speak for itself, whereas the legislative analyst office does the analysis and goes one step further and makes recommendations on policy and budget issues for the California legislature. Thus, my work over the past several years has centered on advising the California legislature about both the economically detrimental effects that the state's climate policy framework would likely produce and making recommendations on ways to improve those policies. And so today I'm going to share with you some insight into the California experience, some practical economic implications of the policies that we have in place, and then lessons learned. So the first lesson is that you really never want to trust a governor who's known for his work as a terminator. This actually should have been our first clue. But Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, we elected a man who claimed to be a proponent of free markets, and instead he gave us the Global Warming Solutions Act. He signed that into law in 2006. And the law basically requires that the state of California reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. It also directed that the state's Air Resources Board, which is essentially like the EPA, it directed them to develop a roadmap or a plan whereby the state would find its way to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that plan has come to known as the AB 32 Scoping Plan. And it now contains roughly 50 regulations within it. One of those is the cap and trade program, and taken together, they're supposed to reduce the state's greenhouse gas emissions down to 1990 levels. AB 32 also designated who in the state would be subject to the state's cap and trade program by setting a threshold limit, and any entity emitting greenhouse gas emissions more than that limit would become subject to the cap and trade program. So as a result, roughly 650 facilities in the state of California are now subject to cap and trade, and this is what 650 looks like on a map. And this is absolutely amazing because it's a map on the Air Resources Board's website. And you've got the ability to kind of zoom in and see each facility's emissions profile, where they're located, et cetera. But what's really remarkable about this image is that you see just how these facilities are literally stacked, one on top of the other. And as part of the AB 32 Scoping Plan, what this now represents is 85% of California's economy now being covered by cap and trade. In November of 2012, the state held its first auction, and since that time, the state has held an additional 10 auctions, and it continues to rake in money as we have these auctions. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the 11th auction was held, and it brought in over $1 billion to state coffers. So let's talk a little bit about how much money this program is estimated to generate. Here's a table here that shows estimates through 2020. And because the cap and trade regulation contains a bounded range whereby you can estimate what the potential revenue is going to be, because it's got a floor price as well as a ceiling price within the regulation, we've estimated that the potential revenue through 2020 is going to be in the tens of billions of dollars. Governor Jerry Brown, just a few weeks ago, came out with his May revision of the state's budget. And in 1 year alone, he estimates that cap and trade will produce $2.2 billion in revenue. We're actually estimating that it's going to be closer to $3 billion. Let me just put that amount in perspective for you, because I think when people hear that, maybe you're used to hearing numbers at the federal level, but this is just at the state level. This is an actually staggering amount of money. So to put this in perspective for you, a few years ago, the California electorate voted to pass a Proposition 30, which would basically increase taxes in order to close the budget gap. And Prop 30 brings in roughly $6 billion a year. This is a program that was created by an unelected board, and it brings in almost half of that. So for a state, these are really large numbers. I did a panel presentation last week in Burbank, and many of the people on the panel were almost gleeful at the amount of money that's coming into state coffers from this program. I'm the Debbie Downer on the panel, and so I have to remind everybody that there's no such thing as a free lunch, and that this money is actually coming from somewhere. This money is coming out of the private sector. And so you cannot take this level of money out of the private sector and not expect to have some sort of impact, whether we're talking about direct or indirect cost. We know that energy prices are going to go up. That's what the program is designed to do. It's designed to put a price on carbon. Regulators have designed the program to essentially send a signal to consumers in order to tell them to consume less carbon. Some have estimated that by 2020, the price per gallon of gasoline may be as high as an additional 74 cents per gallon. Now you layer that on top of the fact that California already has some of the highest gasoline prices in the nation, and I guarantee you consumers will notice. And that's just on the fuel side. On the electricity side, costs are already going up, especially for industrial consumers. And that means that as a result, the cost of goods and services produced in the state are also going to go up. That's because we all know energy is a fundamental input that everything that we do, and a major input to many production processes. So to the extent that energy costs go up, those costs will either be passed along to consumers, depending on the elasticity of the market, or that business will have to absorb the additional cost, which at some point is going to force some businesses to either cut production or look to see where they could potentially produce outside of the state. That obviously means a greater potential for job loss. So I had to remind these folks in Burbank that there's no such thing as free lunch, that climate programs erode purchasing power, and that they have the potential to undermine a business's ability to operate. The California Manufacturers and Technology Association recently completed a study that estimated that through the year 2020, the Global Warming Solutions Act will cost California a total of $135 billion. So to sum up, I think it best can be summed up by P.J. O'Rourke, who says giving money and power to government is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenage boys. There are consequences. It's also important to recognize that these impacts won't be distributed equally. We know that these policies are regressive and that folks at the lower ends of the income ladder spend a higher proportion of their disposable income on energy. And it's much easier for some segments of the population to absorb these impacts than others. So, for example, the folks in Beverly Hills, I can guarantee you they're probably not going to cut down on the amount of miles that they travel because their gas prices go up. But someone in the Central Valley, that decision could look very different for them. And environmentalists like to counter and say, well, this program is producing green jobs. But really, to whom are the benefits really accruing? Some have even dared to call this a welfare program for the 1%. So yes, maybe folks in Silicon Valley are getting a little bit wealthier, but they're being subsidized by poorer communities in California. And most of you have probably seen the recent LA Times article that notes that Elon Musk, who's the owner of Solar City and Tesla, is the recipient of $4.9 billion in government subsidies. And they've noted also that he has a business model that's basically built off of government subsidies. So again, who's really benefiting from California's climate program? Environmentalists like to talk about California's economy and that it's growing at a rate faster than the rest of the country. And they like to attribute that to all of our green policies that we have in place. But what they fail to mention is that the economies of most other states in the nation started to see a turnaround long before California. And so yes, California's economy is growing at a faster rate, but that's generally because we're at a lower point on the recovery curve than most other states, and California has a lot of catching up to do. California also still has the 9th highest unemployment rate in the nation. And in many parts of the state, we still have double-digit unemployment. So for example, Fresno County has 10.2% unemployment. Kern County has 10.3% unemployment. Madera, 10.4. Plumas, 10.5. Kings County, 10.8. Tulare County, 11.5. Sutter County, 11.5. Merced County, 11.6. Colusa County, 15.8% unemployment. Imperial County has a staggering 21.2% unemployment. So lesson number 3, because climate policies are regressive, they tend to exacerbate income inequality. Looking ahead, what's next for California? Because really we know that a lot of this is one-upsmanship, and so we can't just focus on 2020, we have to look beyond 2020. Well, the state Senate last week just passed a package of bills. The first would require the state to cut its petroleum consumption by 50% by 2030. So that's 15 years. California currently consumes 16 billion gallons of gasoline a year, and this law would require the state to cut that in half. Now, unfortunately, the bill didn't have a lot of details. It was pretty short on details. It didn't say exactly how we're going to do that, but it did basically direct the Air Resources Board to go figure it out on their own. Another bill would require that the state reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. So by way of comparison, if you look at who has those levels of greenhouse gas emissions currently, so that 2030 target that the legislature is contemplating, that's the emissions of the country of Iraq. And the 2050 emissions, that target is the equivalent of what North Korea currently emits. So we all know that energy consumption and GDP are correlated. California is currently the world's 7th largest economy. And unless the world discovers a technology that decouples energy consumption from economic activity, it's hard to imagine how the state is actually going to achieve a drastic goal such as this without implementing absolutely draconian tactics. We also know that the head of the Air Resources Board is racking up a number of frequent flyer miles in an attempt to influence other states and countries to implement California-style policies. Our California bureaucrats have regular meetings, not only with US EPA, but many countries around the world, especially as we move toward December, when the UN will hold its next climate summit in Paris. In fact, many climate proponents are coining what we're doing here in California as the road to Paris. So this is the 4th and final lesson from the California experience. What happens in California is not intended to stay in California. This can already be seen in the US EPA's Clean Power Plan that folks have been talking about. The 4 building blocks within that plan, that is straight out of the pages of the ARB's, the Air Resources Board's playbook. Straight out of their playbook. And Gina McCarthy and the head of the Air Resources Board are in communications And they've worked diligently to ensure that as states develop their own compliance strategies for the Clean Power Plan, that those states have the option of joining California's Cap and Trade program. So I'm going to stop here and wrap up and summarize by going back over the lessons learned. So they are, number one, climate policies have consequences. Number two, climate policies tend to disproportionately impact those that can least afford it. Number three, what happens in California will not necessarily stay in California. And number four, unless you want to say hasta la vista to your economy, be sure you know who you're electing to office, because elections have consequences. Thank you.